Is the next phase of the Ukrainian counteroffensive started, or is it just the ebb and flow of the front lines playing tricks on us? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is June 1st, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first, let's take a look at the frontline map updates. So as of yesterday, most of the frontline updates are considered fairly minor, but there is, in fact, one change that I thought was really interesting. And that is right here, outside of Volodymyr. And as you can see, Ukrainian forces have liberated, again, a not very significant, maybe 750 meters wide strip of land outside of this city. And itself, this is not all that significant, right? It doesn't contain major terrain features. It's not along a major intersection. It's pretty innocuous. But I suspect that this could be the start of the next phase of this major counteroffensive. And the reason I say that is because, one, you've seen very little offensive action from either side, though there's been significant efforts by Russian forces to take Volodar, but it's routinely ended in failure. But when we assess the larger tactical situation or the operational situation, we've talked at length about this. The place for Ukrainian forces to try to liberate is this chunk of land right here. The terrain really favors mechanized warfare. It's open. It's not very urbanized. It also means that Russian forces, as you push them back, are going to be stuck going into the sea. And this means that they can't necessarily stretch supply lines. They can't necessarily establish hospitals or supply depots inside Russian sovereign territory, where Ukrainian forces, with a few exceptions, don't really go. And so it means that as you achieve success, the enemy will get more desperate, not actually better equipped, right? You can see how here, if you were to push them towards the border, they would cross the border, and you would see things like hospitals, supply depots, other logistics hubs start to move into Russian sovereign territory, meaning that these troops, the Russian troops, would actually get better supplied and better equipped as you drove them into the border. Not so when you drive them into the sea. And so I strongly suspect, or rather the book answer to the question of where should the counteroffensive take place, is that basically it should take place between this north-south axis to Mariupol and this north-south axis to Melitopol. Where will it actually take place? Well, if you asked me, I would say if you've got 9 brigades to deploy, or rather at least 8 based on who's currently fighting in Bakhmut, you would just do a 4-and-4 split. 4 here, 4 here. You would try to sever these two crucial roadways that really form probably the lifeblood that allows all the Russian forces inside here to sustain the fight. And if you could do that, Russian forces will have a tough time continuing to fight those trapped inside this cauldron. They won't have any resupply other than what Russia can do from the sea, which is very limited, and they won't be able to mount much of a resistance. You might not necessarily have this if you only cut off one side, since, again, Russia can be resupplied via the Kursk Bridge, or, of course, via Luhansk and the LNR. So that's why I see this little piece of data, and it says to me it's in the right spot. This is what we would see if the next phase of the counteroffensive was to begin. And if this was indeed Ukraine's targets, again, I think it's highly possible. There's significant evidence that Russian forces have been reallocated from elsewhere in the front to stabilize the Bakhmut front lines. And now that they are pinned in contact, it's highly likely that the next phase of this counteroffensive is going to effectively push Russian forces in an area where it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to take these forces that are in contact in Bakhmut, move them en masse into this region. And again, if that were the goal, if the goal is to create this cutoff, well, this is exactly where you'd want to do it. You would want to block these forces from being able to actually make it to the line that's in contact. So you would basically, if it were up to me, you'd want to create two axes of advance here and here. And if you know the best source of reinforcements is up here, then the first place you're going to want to go is try to cut off these roadways here. And that's probably what they're doing. I suspect they may try to cross open terrain and then make this roadway, this major roadway, their natural barrier into Mariupol, right? And they may not even choose to take Mariupol. They may simply choose to blockade it. Again, street to street fighting is what Russia wants. It's not what it's by definition not what Ukraine wants to see. Then, of course, you would launch a similar effort right here, cutting south into Melitopol. Again, probably just establishing some sort of blocking position or yielding Melitopol to the Russians because this terrain outside of it is just so open and it'd be so easy to cut off Russian forces from these roadways. And then it's just shooting fish in a barrel with the Russian forces that are forced to remain. You could use things like HIMARS to disrupt Russia's ability to dock ships here and resupply and conduct any level of resupply of these troops sort of stuck inside. Again, that's one possible strategy. But Russia knows this as well. They have the same maps you and I do. They know that this is the prime location for these operations to take place. And so this could be just a deception. It could just be a shaping operation to try to get Russia to commit its reserves in this DNR, LNR area and throw them into the Volodar region and further lock down even more reserve troops. But the reason I think that is, well, we'll get to it in a second. First, of course, I wanted to say, if you see the national security news space, you notice that it is a lot of hyperbole. And so I wanted to launch a newsletter that's totally for free. The link is in the description. And what we do is once a week, we give you the actual news stories that matter in the national security space. We give you a synopsis, a breakdown, and then the so what. So why you actually need to care about this story. Something that I think conventional news outlets just don't do. They don't put things in context, and they make either non-stories. They try to use exaggeration and hyperbole to turn them into some big scary story, and they sometimes ignore major changes to the national security space because they're not, clickbaity. We talk about Japan ramping up a notoriously neutral nation, ramping up its sanctions against Russia and condemning their nuclear moves. And of course, we talk about the major changes to Iran's ballistic missile test amid rising tensions with Israel. So all of this, if you're interested and you want to check it out, the link is in the description, strategicsitrep.com/subscribe. Okay. So talking about the combat map, you guys can see that in the entire Eastern Front lines, one, you can see that Russia has really been trying to create this blanket of artillery fire to compensate for the fact that they have just 21 combat engagements, a huge drop in their combat capabilities. And this is probably one of the lowest that we've seen in the last 6 months. And it's a sign that Russia doesn't have troops to spare. They are focused on this defensive effort. And that when they do use troops on the offensive, they're doing it in small efforts to conduct spoiling attacks, shaping attacks, recon by fires. They're not part of a larger offensive effort. And we get a little insight into this from the Institute for the Study of War that points out that it sounds like now that Wagner forces have withdrawn, the Chechens have been ordered to begin offensive operations in Ukraine, particularly around Donetsk Oblast. And what I find interesting is that the Chechen forces, right, we have to remember the Chechens are headed by Kadyrov. And Kadyrov is first and foremost committed to staying in power. Chechnya is a more tribal society. And so having the tribe with the largest concentration of force is really important and to staying in power. So what Kadyrov does not want to have happen is what happened to Wagner Group, which is that they were a large military force and they have been attrited down in this war to something much smaller. Wagner is still very effective, make no mistake, but Kadyrov has spent a lot of time and effort equipping his Chechen forces, and by and large, they have been confined to support roles in this conflict. Of course, the reason is he needs them. He needs them to be alive. He needs them to be loyal. Oftentimes, these are staffed with Chechen loyalists, people loyal to Kadyrov and his family and tribe. And so he doesn't want them to take casualties unnecessarily. But ultimately, this comes down to Russia trying to assert federal control of their forces and really try to force them. Again, it says Kadyrov's forces operate largely as a police force in the rear, performing localized reconnaissance and force, sometimes in Zaporizhzhia. And the forces are being conserved. But the federal Russian forces, the Kremlin, is trying to get these guys to get back into the fight. And the problem is that Kadyrov is not quite the savvy actor that Prigozhin is, which means that he may not realize that the federal government actually doesn't have a ton of authority to boss him around. Just like he unilaterally chose to withdraw his fighters from Bakhmut, he may simply not realize that he can tell Russia to pound sand. What are they going to do? What military force are they going to send after him if he refuses to have his Chechens fight? None of them. Nobody. They can't beat the Ukrainians. What are they going to do? Beat the Ukrainians and the Chechens? No chance. So this is, again, fascinating. Kadyrov may believe that his loyalty will be rewarded. He'll be sacrificing a lot of Chechens. That will be rewarded by the Kremlin, especially in the face of Prigozhin. Sort of, again, I say abandoning his post, so to speak, but at the end of the day, Kadyrov hasn't done dick for the war, whereas Prigozhin has achieved the only operational victory that Russia can claim. So, again, it's tough to know how this power play is working. Kadyrov may tell himself that he is demonstrating loyalty to Putin on an imagined reward later. He may actually not have a choice. But I think it's most likely that he just believes he doesn't have a choice. And he may have just said yes and not do anything. Right. And I think that is where the evidence currently lies. As you can see, it's not a lot of evidence that the Chechens are really out there crushing it. They're barely doing anything necessary, right? Light offensive actions, minimal contact, and that's what you'd want to do. You want to do the minimum necessary to keep the Kremlin off your back. So all in all, again, not really a great replacement, a very milquetoast replacement for the Wagner Group, who of course is war criminals for sure. But also, you can't argue with the fact their commitment to achieving this victory is absolutely ironclad. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you, as always, to the Colonel tier members of CombatVetNews.com. And thanks to our Lieutenant tier members. I really couldn't do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I'll see you all in the next one.